In 1968, Paul Ehrlich published probably the best-selling book about demography ever written, called "The Population Bomb." On the cover, it said, "While you are reading these words, 4 people will have died from starvation, most of them children." Ehrlich's fear was that unless we take radical steps that many countries like China did take, in part inspired by Ehrlich in the subsequent years, to reduce the global population, we're going to have a terrible human suffering on our hands. In your new book, you say that actually the concern is the other way around. Actually, the concern today is not overpopulation, but underpopulation. What did Ehrlich and other people inspired by Malthus get wrong? Why should we worry about depopulation rather than overpopulation?
So Ehrlich and the 20th century overpopulation doomers were wrong on their values, and they were wrong on the facts. Let's start with the facts. Global depopulation is now the most likely future. What global depopulation means is that every decade, every generation, the world's population will shrink. That's the path we're on. Within a few decades, the world's population will begin to decline, and there's no reason to think that once that happens, it'll automatically reverse. So a big question before us is, should we welcome that, or should we want something else to happen? Ehrlich missed that depopulation was coming, and he probably wouldn't have answered the question of should we welcome it right either, because depopulation won't solve climate change or reduce global poverty or make the world fairer. In fact, we stand to lose something important because people are a core ingredient in scientific and social progress. Other people are win-win. Their lives are good for them and good for you.
So I think you're already teasing 2 of the main questions that I want to get at in this conversation. Perhaps we'll add a third. So the first question to me is depopulation actually happening, right? I think the instinct that a lot of the listeners to this podcast are going to have, even though it's, I think, a particularly interested and well-informed audience, is, well, hang on a second, isn't the population still growing a lot? Aren't there many countries in Africa that still have 5, 6 children per woman? How can we be so confident that depopulation is actually going to happen? And the second question is, well, perhaps that's a good thing. What about those concerns about climate change, the use of global resources, etc.? Perhaps humans are a cancer on the planet and there should be fewer humans, right? And the third question I want to get at is, well, if we buy those first 2 arguments from you, what do we do about it? How do we actually respond to all of that? So let's start with this empirical premise, right? I'm a skeptic of how easy it is to project things in the social sciences, right? Economists famously have predicted 12 out of the last 3 recessions. Political scientists didn't see the rise of authoritarian populism and the crisis of democracy coming at all. 2016 was a complete surprise to them. Often we get things wrong in demography as well. How can we predict with such confidence that even though the global population still seems to be growing, even though it grew a lot over the course of the 20th century, this is going to reverse very soon. We're going to start depopulation. I suspect your answer is going to have something to do with the idea of population momentum.
Well, it's going to start... Oh.
Sure. I'll take the first part of that question. And maybe it's useful to just take a step back and just give a bit of context of where we've been over the last couple of centuries. For most of human history, going back thousands of years, the global population was pretty small. 10,000 years ago, there were maybe 5 million people on the planet, the size of Atlanta today. It wasn't until about 1800 that we had 1 billion people on the planet for the first time. And then in the century that followed that, through 1925, the world doubled to 2 billion. And then since then, we've quadrupled. We've doubled and doubled again to the present 8.2 billion. And I understand the intuition that many people would have that we live in a big growing world and there's no reason to think that that's going to reverse, because that's the only experience that any of us have had, is living in a population that was big and growing fast. But interestingly, this whole time that the population has been growing and that we have good statistics recording the demography, recording birth rates all around the world, that has been a period during which birth rates have been falling. So even as the population has been growing, birth rates have been falling. And that's the first clue to understand how we can know that depopulation is around the corner. So the reason that the population has been skyrocketing over the last couple of centuries is not because people are having more babies than they used to. It's because we've done a better job learning how to keep people alive. And so more children grow up to become adults who have children of their own. Whereas a couple hundred years ago, maybe 30, 40, 50% of children would have died before age 5. A very small fraction, even in the poorest places of the world, die in childhood today. And so there's been these two things that have been happening simultaneously. Population's been growing, birth rates have been falling. And today, in 2/3 of the countries on Earth, or in 2/3 of the populations on Earth, birth rates are too low to sustain populations over time. So what's the magic number there is a total fertility rate of two kids per 2 adults. Below that level, each successive generation is smaller than the last. And so over the long run, the global population will shrink. So the
and just
answer—
to cut in for one
yes.
second, I think part of the striking thing here, right, is that, yes, there are some countries that still have rapid population growth. Kenya, Chad, other places in sub-Saharan Africa in particular among them. But lots of countries that I think a lot of the audience here would think are growing fast actually have now fallen below that magical threshold. So Mexico is below that magical threshold. The Islamic Republic of Iran, despite its ideology, is well below that threshold. The country of India, which is where Paul Ehrlich starts his book in 1968, describing in pretty unpleasant terms the teeming mass of humanity crushing down on him as he's walking through the old streets of Delhi, that helped to inspire that fear of his, is now just about below replacement rate. Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
No, that's right. And I think some people who haven't, for good reason, this hasn't been the issue they've been paying attention to in the last decade, might think this is a phenomenon of rich countries. This is a phenomenon of, North America, or this phenomenon of Europe, or of a couple select Southeast Asian countries like South Korea. But India has below replacement birth rates. Latin America as a whole has a birth rate of 1.8 kids per 2 adults, so it's also on course to shrink. Really, the only region on Earth where birth rates are still above 2 is sub-Saharan Africa. But there, too, birth rates are falling. So whereas in the mid-20th century, there might have been 5 or 6 children per woman, today there are 4, and 4 is still above 2. But we should expect that sub-Saharan Africa will follow the same course in some time that the rest of the world has as it's developed. Fewer children, smaller birth rates, and eventually on path to a shrinking population.
And one of the striking things about sub-Saharan Africa, I think, is that it is by far and away the poorest region of the world, and there's a strong correlation between affluence and birth rates. But relative to level of GDP, Africa actually has lower birth rates than other continents did at the same stage of development. So when,
and education is another thing too. So I think GDP is one thing, but when we think about it, one of the things that we emphasize is the level of secondary school education, especially for girls. Sub-Saharan Africa right now has a low level of female education that's sort of like what was true for India a few decades ago, and it's sort of at an average birth rate like where India was a few decades ago. But if you look right now, schooling in India, like secondary schooling for girls, is around 70%, and their birth rate's sort of right at 2. Kenya's at 53%, and their birth rate's at 3 point something. Mozambique's at around 1/3, and their birth rate is close to 5. And so it would be a real stepping off the path that other countries have followed if, as education and socioeconomic development of other sorts comes to sub-Saharan Africa, we don't see birth rates falling there too, which is what the demography community basically projects.
Isn't there one assumption behind this that, perhaps we can't fully assume, which is that I buy that there's nothing culturally different or specific about sub-Saharan Africa such that, if the Philippines, which had a lot of kids at one point in time, if Pakistan, which had a lot of kids at one point in time, if Ireland, which had a lot of kids at one point in time, start to have fewer and fewer kids as it became more affluent, as more women gained in education, somehow Africa is going to be the big exception. But what we are assuming in the background here is that Africa is going to continue to develop rapidly economically, that the share of women who are able to access education is going to increase, etc. And can we be sure of that assumption? Can we be sure of the assumption that there's going to be that level of economic progress in sub-Saharan Africa? Can we be sure, for that matter, that there might not be regions in the world that fall back into abject poverty, where perhaps fewer people are going to be able to access education in the future, and where, therefore, we also see a commensurate rise in the fertility rate in the decades to come?
No, I think there's no guarantees of anything. So let's be really clear about this. When we raise sound the wake up call about global depopulation, we're not making a prediction that there's a guarantee that depopulation is going to begin in 2060 or 2070 or 2080. Those are the ranges of forecasts and projections that groups like the UN put forth. Certainly, all sorts of futures are possible, and in some sense, if we didn't think that something different than global depopulation was possible in at the end of the century, we wouldn't have written this book. Now, the possibility that you're raising that things just get worse, that we regress on all sorts of progress socially, economically, and that ends up being a cause of birth rates rising. I don't think we're at the end of history. I think, we can't, there's no guarantees that progress will continue. But that would be awful, right? Like that's, we're talking about one sort of risk here, which is the risk that even as the world gets better, we're headed to this unfamiliar future because the globe is going to shrink rapidly. You're talking about another sort of risk where we actually fail to continue to make progress and regress. And that's also a risk we should take seriously too. But I want to say just one word, because I think it could be hard to really get a feel for how quickly global depopulation could happen. We've had this sort of hockey stick growth in the global human population over the last couple of centuries, but the decline could be just as steep. And a way to see this is think about a birth rate like China has right now. China's an outlier. It's relatively low, but it makes the math a lot easier to do in our heads. So for the Chinese birth rate right now, total fertility rate is 1, which means that for 2 adults, there's 1 child. And so what that means is that in a generation of adults of 100 people, there would be 50 children. And then in the following generation, the grandchildren's generation, there would be 25 grandchildren. So that means that over the course of a couple of generations, maybe 60 or 70 years, you would have the size of cohorts declining by 75%. And if you think to some numbers that we can't do in our head, but are maybe more representative of the world, the average birth rate in the 140 richest countries today is about 1.5, averaged over all of those countries. An average birth rate of 1.5 is a future in which the global population declines by 10% every decade, by 2/3 every century. And so this really could come fast in a way that I think is sort of not very apparent or visible when we look around the world and we see a birth rate like 1.5, which is probably not very different from where you are in Maryland or Virginia and DC, and think of that as sort of normal, because that normalcy is going to lead to something profoundly unfamiliar in the future.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of things about this math that is unintuitive but really important to understand, right? It doesn't feel like, whether on average families have 2 kids or on average that have 1.5 kids is going to make such a vast difference. But you play out the math and it turns out that it does make that very, very big difference, which is something that people really, I think, underestimate. I want to get for a moment at this idea of population momentum. One of the things that makes it hard to predict the business cycle, for example, is that things can turn very, very quickly. And, something that happened 20 years ago doesn't necessarily have a big impact on what the economy is today, at least in terms of whether it's growing or declining. In demography, it's still difficult to predict, and I'm struck, having done a little bit of research on this, that the 4 major organizations trying to predict exactly how many people there's going to be in 2100 have pretty different views about this. But there's this idea of population momentum that does allow us to make predictions with greater accuracy than in some other areas of social science, because if you want somebody to have a kid 25 years from now, they're probably got to be born today, or they're going to be born in 10 years or whatever, right? Like the size of the cohort of 1-year-olds today just tells you something about the kind of parameters of how many children people might have in 20, 30, 40 years. So tell us a little bit about that, and tell us what you think the most realistic scenario is for what the world population is going to look like in 25 years, in 50 years, in 100 years, perhaps if you want to go that far, in 200 years. Given the slightly different estimates made by different organizations, what is the best projection, and presumably that informed your book title after the spike, are we coming down from the spike, and what does the world look like once we've passed the spike?
Yeah, so population momentum is an idea from formal demography that is about how the age structure of the population impacts how population growth unfolds separate from birth rates and death rates. So the biggest picture, the Earth is a closed system. We enter it by being born, we leave it by dying. So birth rates and death rates are going to completely pin down the simplest model of how population changes. But that's in a medium to long run. In a short to medium run, the fact that there are, for example, a lot of children alive right now means that they're going to grow up and have children, and so that fact about how old people are is going to change how the population grows. And so the surprising fact about population momentum is that even if birth rates were to go to 2 today, or to go to whatever the replacement level is, the size of the population would keep growing for decades as the children that we have now grow up into being of reproductive age and have children. And so there's only so much that the size of the population, the world's population, could deviate from its most likely path over the coming decades, even if birth rates are very different. So that's one thing that we know about what's likely to happen. But that's very different from exactly what is going to be the size of the world population or the speed at which the population is changing in the 2080s and 2100 or 2200. And here I think the most important thing to say is no, of course we don't have a crystal ball, and we don't know exactly how far below 2 the world's average birth rate is going to fall. But in some sense, we don't need to understand the most important thing, which is that depopulation is the most likely future. If, on average, the birth rate is less than 2 kids per 2 adults, if it's essentially anywhere for the world as a whole, less than an average of 2 kids per 2 adults, then we're going to get global depopulation. And the same exponential algebra that governed the upslope would govern the downslope. So it could be very fast. The size of the world population quadrupled in the past 100 years. The decrease could be similar. The size of the world population doubled in the 100 years before that. The decrease could be similar. Exactly which of those speeds it will be depends on just how fast or just how low the average birth rate falls below 2. So, do we have reason to expect that it's definitely going to be 1.5 like in Europe or 1.6 in the US? No. I mean, like we said, we don't know exactly how fast education is going to change in Africa. We don't really even know how much of that is an effect of education as opposed to the fact that people who would have had different numbers of kids are more or less likely to go to school anyway. There are lots of details like that we don't know, and those details rightly fill the careers of population scientists and journals and research papers and understanding them. But for the biggest picture, which is that depopulation is the most likely future, and that once it happens, it could be fast and exponential, all we need to know is that it's likely that the average birth rate for the world as a whole is going to go somewhere below 2 for a long time.
Yeah, it seems to me, having looked at this a little bit, but there is very good reason to think that, and there's even stronger reason to be confident that all of those countries that now have birth rates that are significantly below 2 are going to be depopulating. So it may be a little bit harder to predict exactly the speed with which fertility rates are going to continue falling in sub-Saharan Africa. It is very clear that the next generation, the generation after that, is going to be vastly smaller in Italy, in China, probably given the trends of the last few years in the United States as well, and that in itself is a topic worth taking very seriously. So I want to shift, as it were, to the second set of questions that I'm sure listeners are going to have. And that is, all right, so let's say that we are after the spike. that we're in the last little moments in which population is continuing to grow just because the way that age cohorts work, but we're about to start experiencing this rapid decline in population. Well, why is that a bad thing? Isn't it the case that we're so worried about climate change? Isn't it the case that the Club of Rome keeps talking about all of the global resources that are being depleted? Isn't it the case that finding an apartment in New York City or Tokyo or Paris is already incredibly expensive? Wouldn't it in some ways be nicer if we had fewer people? Why do you think the world would not in fact be nicer if we were experiencing, certainly let's leave some poorer parts of the world out of the picture at the moment, certainly if affluent societies like the United States, like Southern Europe, like East Asia, were to experience a very rapid population decline in years to come.
Yeah, so this is maybe the most frequent comment, question, reaction that I hear from all sorts of people, including our students at the University of Texas, when we talk about population change, is this idea that, look, human activity pollutes, it destroys. Wouldn't things just be better for all sorts of things we care about, and especially environmental outcomes, if there were just fewer of us? And also, wouldn't there be more to go around? Maybe let's hold that second one for a moment and hold first on the environment. The problem with that is that the facts in history just don't bear out that logic in a way that we might expect. So let me tell a little story. So in 2013 in China, the smog there was making international news. So newspapers were calling it the air apocalypse, the particulate matter air pollution, which comes from burning coal and vehicle exhaust and wildfires. That was completely choking the sky. There's a standard air quality index measure that goes from 0 to 500, and the reading in Beijing on that scale from 0 to 500 was 755. So this was like an international scandal. And so that was 2013. In the decade that followed, China added 50 million people to its population. So that's like the size of the population of Canada. It's bigger than Texas. It's bigger than California, just that addition. And so how much worse did air pollution get over that decade? Well, maybe surprisingly, if what you expect is more people mean more problems, air pollution fell by half. And it's not just China. It's not sort of a cherry-picked example. As over the last decade, the world as a whole added 750 million people, air pollution overall, particulate air pollution, has fallen. And facts like that kind of challenge this basic assumption that so many of us have, that more people means more environmental problems. And at the core of that, I think, is a bit of a misunderstanding of how environmental progress, where it's been achieved, when it's been achieved, has actually worked. I've been thinking recently about the problem, to give an example, the problem of lead in the air in the 1960s in the US. So in the 1960s, people were breathing in lead in the air. The reason they were breathing in lead was that we were burning leaded gasoline in our vehicles. Right? Today, we don't breathe in lead. An additional person in the United States doesn't cause more lead to be pumped into the air. And the reason is that in the 1970s, through the Clean Air Act and other regulation, we regulated leaded gasoline basically out of existence. It would have been, silly in 1970 to think that the way we're going to deal with lead in the air is that we're going to wait for or hope for or try to bring about a scenario in which there's fewer drivers. Right? That just would not have been a serious solution to the problem of burning lead and breathing it in. That's something that needed to be taken on directly by targeting the pollution. And I worry that when people think about population and big environmental problems like climate change, they're sometimes making the same sort of error. They're thinking that the way to bring down greenhouse gas emissions, which are caused by human activity, is to reduce the number of humans, not to change the activity. But that's never been the way that environmental progress has been made. If we want to deal with greenhouse gas emissions, we need to build solar farms, turn on wind turbines, activate nuclear reactors, lay transmission lines across the United States to move energy from where the sun is shining and where the wind is blowing to where it's not. A smaller population in itself is not going to accomplish any of that, nor is it going to green our industrial technologies. A smaller population is not going to cause the invention of low carbon concrete. So the lesson that we should learn from the history of environmental progress, and there has been environmental progress. We've cleaned the water. We've reduced the damage that we were doing to the stratospheric ozone layer, the protective stratospheric ozone layer. We've taken lead out of the air. We've been cleaning up particulate air pollution. All of that has happened by directly targeting the pollutants. And so, the way I think about this is dealing with huge environmental challenges like climate change are going to require that billions of us live and consume differently. It's not going to require that billions of us never live. And I think we've for too long been sort of you mentioned r.i.c.e at the top of the show. And I think for too long we've been riding the same line that r.i.c.e set up for us in 1968, thinking that people are problems and every additional person just increases our problems. But that's just not what history has shown.
Yeah, I think it feels like this podcast is turning into a math podcast, which is not my usual style. But again, on the math of carbon emissions, I was really struck when I read about this, right? So Britain is debating whether it should stick to its goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. Right? If we're serious about curbing climate change, we need to find some solution like that, right? Where basically we're no longer emitting any net carbon, in the course of the next 30 years or so, right? Now let's imagine, for the sake of argument, which actually turns out to be wrong because there's a lot of pre-existing infrastructure, because more dense cities actually emit far less carbon per person than more rural living, etc. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that each additional person is proportionately more carbon emitted, that one person less is proportionally less carbon emitted. And let's say that the population of the United States would shrink by 25% by 2050, which would be incredibly rapid and set up a huge population problem down the line. Well, that's just not enough, right? If we reduce the carbon we're emitting by 25% by 2050, this is one of the nightmare scenarios where climate change is probably going to go completely out of whack. So it's just, if you're thinking about what are the levers in order to solve climate change, the kind of dimensions that we're talking about with human population, unless there's a catastrophic nuclear war that decimates the population by 99.9%, it's just not going to get us to where we need to get on climate change. And that, I think, is really instructive to say, look, if the United States population shrunk by 25%, and it meant, which it doesn't, but that reduces carbon by 25%, we still wouldn't be anywhere close to the scale of solution we need in order to deal with the problem of climate change. Going beyond the environmental question, what other reasons do we have to worry about this? I mean, why is it that a society which is rapidly depopulating might not have the economic dynamism we take for granted, might struggle to provide for its older people or for other people who are needy, maybe less inventive, may just be less appealing in all kinds of different dimensions?
So, here's one reason why depopulation matters and why we should want to avoid it, which is that we're all made better off by sharing the world with more other people alive alongside us than alive before us, because other people make the discoveries and have the ideas that improve our lives. Other people are where science and knowledge come from. So it sounds counterintuitive to think that other people could improve our living standards and be good for us. And so let's start with a big question. Why are our lives today better than lives 200 years ago or 300 years ago? Why do we have shoes on our feet and glasses to correct our vision and plenty to eat and shorter work days and medicines to treat our diseases and a huge library of literature and so much social insurance for people who are elderly and disabled? Why do we have all of these things? It's the same dirt beneath our feet. It's the same sun shining on us, the same wind. There's so much that's the same. What's different is that we know more. We now know what to do with the resources on the earth. We now know how to organize ourselves better. We know how to farm more efficiently and make computer chips and make soap to keep us from getting infections, make antibiotics to treat infections if we get them anyway. And most importantly, we have a germ theory of disease to better understand what an infection is in the first place. And all of these things are ideas or discoveries or notions or creations that people had over those couple hundred years between now and then. 200 years ago, there were an eighth as many of us. There were about 1 billion of us. And so imagine if all along, every year, somehow we got to it being 2025 and there were 1 billion of us every year. Does it really seem plausible that we could know and understand the things that we do? Would we know the things we now know about how to organize a cancer drug trial, or a kindergarten that teaches phonics, or a parliamentary democracy? We learned all of these things together as one generation iterated on the advances of the last, as a mentee carried further the ideas of a mentor, as team members discovered together what none could do alone. So Paul Romer is an economist who won a Nobel Prize, an economics Nobel Prize, for working out the formal theory behind this idea. And the critical economic idea is that knowledge is a special resource that gets used but doesn't get used up. So if a child's infection is treated with an antibiotic, something that nobody could have done 150 years ago, then that pill is gone. No one's ever going to take that antibiotic pill again. But the formula behind that pill, the formula of the drug, and more importantly, the scientific knowledge and the germ theory of disease that let them make it, that all remains. That's all still there for someone else to use again. So when we think about the economics of population, the place we might go first is to think about resources getting used up. But what Romer's theory of endogenous growth tells us, and what we see in the world and in the evidence, is that the most important resource for improving our living standards are these sorts of ideas, and they have come from the work and the collaborations of other people. So without other people in a depopulating future, we wouldn't continue to make so much progress, and we'd be worse off, each of us, we'd be worse off per person than in a stabilized future that didn't depopulate.
So let me push you on this idea for a moment. There's something plausible about this, right? That there are rare geniuses in the world who are able to have ideas that perhaps other people might not. Or to put it differently, that perhaps some ideas just take a lot of collaboration, takes a lot of people working on them. And the more people we have, the more likely we are to be able to do that. There's also kind of different intuition, right? Which is to say that when you look at the contributions of some of the great figures in history, Michelangelo, Plato, whoever, partially they could contribute to so many different fields because there wasn't as much knowledge there weren't as many people competing for these ideas and so on, right? And so perhaps if we didn't have as many people, then the people who are really brilliant could just make more contributions to more different fields. And if there's an idea out there to be had, perhaps an affluent world with 2 billion people might end up discovering a very similar amount of them than an affluent world with 10 billion people, right? So is sort of how convincing is it that really the rate of progress is going to slow so significantly just because there's fewer people? And is the main concern we have about the sheer number of people that are there to make those discoveries, or is it about how dynamic a society is, right? I mean, another element of a shrinking society is just one that, if we want to make sure that people are well taken care of when they're elderly, we just have to allocate an ever-growing percentage of our wealth to the healthcare system, to people who look after those elderly folks, right? Perhaps if there's need for social changes, those are very, very hard to get through in a population that skews really older, elderly, because they're much more likely to resist various changes, right? When I look at Europe today, there's a huge need for investment into the technologies of the future and to revitalizing the European economy. One reason that's hard to do is that a huge percentage of state expenditures goes on very generous pension schemes. And since pensioners are such a big share of the electorate, and since they're more likely to vote, any politician who tries to change that might run into trouble, right? So is the main concern really this idea about just the sheer number of inventions we're going to have in the world in order to make it better? Or is it more about the dynamic and the age structure you're going to have in that kind of society? Or perhaps is it both, and if so, why?
Yeah, so I think it is both, and I think these things operate on different timescales. I think in the short run, there's going to be fiscal pressures on governments as the populations age, and as there's a smaller share of people who are working and a larger share of people who are retirees, who need social support through public pension systems, public healthcare systems. What we're most interested in our book is the longer term consequences. One thing that you mentioned was this idea that people like Michelangelo could contribute to so many fields because there just weren't that many other people innovating. You might say the same thing about someone like Newton, who would contribute to calculus and contribute to physics, right? One of the I'll try not to get too deep into the economic weeds, but one of the active areas of research in economics is the question of, are ideas getting harder to find? In some sense, people like Newton might have picked all the low-hanging fruit, and so now we have to work harder and harder to squeeze the next, to mix metaphors, to squeeze the next bit of juice out of the fruit on the tree. We have to climb higher. It's harder. It's more difficult. And so that means that two things can be true. It might have been the case that progress, measured however you want to measure it, in terms of longer lifespans, better lives, higher GDP, wherever you can get a proxy for that progress in productivity was not so much slower long ago than today, when long ago there were fewer people. But in part, that's because it is now taking larger teams of people, more research effort, a higher fraction of the population dedicated to innovation and R&D and pressing the frontier forward to actually continue making the same annual rate of progress that relatively few people could do in our past. So I actually think looking back to the past and saying, look, we made a lot of progress back then with these rare luminaries is actually not a good model to think about what might be true of our future when we need to assemble like a huge, complex web of niche specialization, to get our next innovation. For example, the mRNA vaccines that came just in time to rescue us from kind of the worst outcomes of COVID, that was a collaboration or sort of a synthesis of work that spanned states and countries and decades and specialties. And that's not, unlike Newton writing the Principia, that's not something that a single person can do. So I actually do think that there's something serious at risk when we're talking about shrinking a global population that relies on such niche specialization to make progress.
Yeah, I do find that convincing. Part of his argument is not just, one, I think, slightly naive version of his argument is just to say, we need geniuses in the world to discover stuff, and if we only have 1 billion people, then it's not going to be enough geniuses, and if we have 10 billion people, then there's going to be enough geniuses or something like that. And that doesn't strike me as particularly convincing, in part because in a much smaller world in the past, there were people we now think of, I think rightly, as geniuses, and in part because there'd still be a lot of people because that's not exactly how discoveries work today, right? In fact, the reason why it's harder to have geniuses today is precisely because we're so specialized. But there's another set of arguments, which is not just about the availability of the super smart specialized researchers who are able to develop those special skills that it takes now in order to discover those ideas that are harder to reach. It's also about the demand for that, actually, right? In order to have this team of 200 people working on commercializing the mRNA vaccine, you also have to have a market which you think is going to make it financially viable. And if you have a lot fewer people in the world, a lot fewer of those kind of activities are going to be financially viable. And we're just not going to be able to marshal the economic resources to have all of those different teams deployed to do that. And that's, I think, part of the dynamic here as well. There is another argument, too, which is a little bit more philosophical, and I wonder how you feel about it. Should we just care in itself about the size of the population? Now, obviously, we would care if 9 billion people died in some horrible accident, right? If let's assume there would be 10 billion people in the world, which isn't quite yet. If 9 billion people died of a nuclear war or some kind of terrible natural disaster, of course we would care because those are humans who are already there, right? And I hope that the listeners to this podcast all share that intuition. Now, I think the intuitions go further apart when we say, well, look, people having fewer children is not some horrible national disaster. It's not some awful accident in which people die a horrible death. It's just lives who were never born, right? And if by this natural process that doesn't involve suffering, we end up with a world of 1 billion people, is that just as good as having a world of 10 billion people, assuming that those lives are similarly thriving? I mean, is there just a reason to think if we can have a world in which there's 10 billion people, most of whom lead thriving lives, should we prefer that to having a world in which there's only 1 billion people who have thriving lives? How do we think about that kind of slightly abstract, but I think important and interesting philosophical dimension?
So, right. So a big part of the case for people and why it matters if the future is on a path towards depopulation or on a path towards stabilization is that it's not the same for living standards. It wouldn't be the case that we would have the same level of thriving, the same level of poverty reduction. We wouldn't be on the same path towards abundance, towards continuing the global fight against infant mortality and other problems because of what people do for one another. And part of that we've talked about is innovation, which really isn't about geniuses. It's just about the way that we all build upon the ideas of one another. And part of that is, as you say, the fact that when other people want and need the things that we want and need, they make it more likely for us to get it. So if other people, need the same, specialized medical treatment that you need, then they're making it more likely that sort of hospital service is available. If other people want and need the same transportation network that you do, they're making it more likely to exist. So other people make us better off per person, and so we wouldn't have the same sorts of progress towards better living standards and abundance without them. But there's another part of the case for people to ask about, which is, that many billions of lives that could be excellent and full of well-being and joy would never be lived on the path to depopulation. So one of the biggest and toughest questions for people to grapple with is, would that silence be a peace to welcome or a loss and an absence to mourn? What does it matter if another person gets to be born to live a good life? And what does it matter if they don't? What if billions of people don't? And so we can stack up and tabulate the consequences for parents, for the environment. We can do the economics about technological progress and living standards. But this question is, should we also give some consideration, maybe not every consideration, but not zero, to the would-be people who would exist if the population stabilizes and not exist as the population declines? Does that figure into our thinking about what would be better, or should we only care about the well-being of people here and now? I mean, our answer that we give in the book and that we talk through is that we think that the chance to live a good life matters. We think it does count for something in comparing stabilization to depopulation to say that more people would get to live a good life. Now, that doesn't imply that anybody should try to force anybody else to be a parent or not to be a parent. Something can both matter and be a matter of free choice. We think that whether or not billions of people have a chance to live a good life is one of the things that matters when we're considering whether stabilization or depopulation would be a better future.
Yeah, and I know from experience talking to people about this that my instincts on this, my intuitions on this differ quite widely from those of many others. So I think that probably a lot of people listening to this just don't have that same instinct. And there's a very complicated, interesting philosophical literature on how to think through this question, inspired by Derek Parfit and then taken up by many other researchers over the last decades. But to me, there is a relatively simple thought experiment which indicates why we should care, which is if you say, is a world better in which there's 10 billion people living thriving lives, or one in which 1 billion people are living thriving lives? A lot of people sort of don't have a strong intuition, and I think that's partially because, as people who think about economic policy a lot say, anything with too many numbers of them just looks the same to people, right? Like whether some bill costs $5 billion or $1 trillion is a humongous difference, but it kind of sounds the same, right? I mean, I think about this stuff quite a lot for my work, and even to me, Like, if it's going to cost 5 billion people or 1 trillion people, I know rationally it's not the same, but it feels the same, right? And I think there's something similar about that. Like, a billion people is so unimaginably large that, well, perhaps 1 billion people is just as good as 10 billion. Who cares? It's all big numbers, right? But let's spread the numbers out a little bit further. Let's imagine one world in which there's a billion people living worthwhile lives, starting families, producing art, hanging out with each other, having a thriving human life. And the other society, there's 10 people living thriving lives. Now, I take your point, Dean, but actually it's very hard to imagine that 10 people really could lead such thriving lives because there wouldn't be the economies of scale and all of the specialization and so on we need to make, there's not many antibiotics in a world of 10 people. Let's let all of that aside, right? We're in a world where 10 people live these thriving lives. Well, obviously to me, it seems like, well, that's just 10 people. Like, I'm glad they're having good lives, but that's very few people. Like, there's so little variety of human experience, etc. Like, surely it would be better to have a world of 1 billion people than a world of 10 people. And so it seems to me that indicates that we do have a strong intuition that actually the number of people matters, and that if we can increase the number of people who live with our lives by 10x, that's something we should care about, even if we're talking about numbers that are kind of so abstract that we don't immediately feel that intuition.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So, one of the starting points in our book is that, we say that the general welfare matters, that when it comes to questions of what societies and governments should do, then caring about the general welfare, about how well things go overall, just has to be an important item on the list of things that matter. Other things can matter too. The U.S. Constitution says that we should promote the general welfare and also have a list of rights. And so, all I'm trying to say right now is that the overall general welfare, how good the things are going, how good the future is one of the things that matters. And so then the question is the question that you're asking, if there are 10 billion people or 1,000 people or 10 people and they somehow had the same quality of life, would that matter? Would that make a difference? And I think, that's one intuition you have. Other people have other intuitions. I don't think that a few minutes of podcast is going to settle the question for very many people, but we can go beyond intuition. And that's one of the things that we talk about in the book. So for example, some people say that what matters is the quality of life, not the quantity. And so you would want to measure that with how well people are on average. If 10 billion people and 1 billion people had the same quality of life on average, then, judging what future would be better, these would say it's just as good. So if all that matters is average well-being, then, that would be a tie. But the average, along with any other metric that only cares about the quality of life and not about the quantity of life, turns out to be a bad way to assess things, turns out to be a bad measurement of the general welfare. And here's sort of how we can see that the average, or that ignoring the quantity of lives, is a bad way to assess things. So imagine a child born in Uttar Pradesh, which is a disadvantaged state in India. It turns out to be the place where I do my research and I work. And imagine this kid born in Uttar Pradesh is born next year, and that she's lucky. She's poor by your standards, but her family loves her. She manages to avoid serious illness. She's happy and healthy as a child. She enjoys her siblings. She rides the tide of improving gender equity to get to go to a school she likes, and she finds a job she's proud of, maybe as a nurse. And as an adult, she still enjoys her siblings and gets to call them and talk with them, walking to and from work. She has an arranged marriage, but her parents give her a say in it, and it turns out to be a good match, and she's friends with her sisters-in-law. And, she likes being a parent, and things, go well for her in her adult life. She's healthier and wealthier and safer than most women who grew up in that part of the world in decades and centuries past, even if she's not as healthy and wealthy as we are, or as most people who read this book. And so, in short, she grows up to live a life that's happy, but also below average for the world in 2025. Now, she wouldn't trade her life for non-existence after thoughtful meditation on the question. She's glad to be alive. But her well-being, what if we further imagine that it's below average not only for 2025, but for all time? right? So as part of the overall human population, her life is good to her, but below average. And so here's the question. Did her existence make things worse? Would the general welfare have been better without her? Not according to her. She wants her life. And we say that makes a lot of sense. But if what you're fixated on is average well-being and you're ignoring the quantity, then you'd be locked into saying that the universe would be better off without her because her existence would nudge down the average. And so that's one way to see that this average-only approach goes wrong, and more broadly, that any approach that only looks at the quality of lives and not the quantity of lives has to go wrong as an account of the general welfare. So, what we say is that both the quality of lives and the quantity of lives matter. That still leaves open plenty of open questions. How exactly should we weigh quality against quantity, and how should we make trade-offs? And, we talk about these things, but we don't really need to settle those to know what to do between depopulation and stabilization, because a stabilized future compared to a depopulating future is going to be one where both the average quality of life is greater, the overall quantity of life is better, things are going to be better on average and in total. And that's a theme of our book, that other people are win-win. Other people are good for them and good for you. And so we're used to rejecting this sort of zero-sum thinking in so many other areas. We know to reject zero-sum thinking about international trade. We know to reject zero-sum thinking about the environment, that we all have to decarbonize together. But we still have this zero-sum approach to the population and to other people. And so part of what we're hoping to accomplish is to get people out of that zero-sum mindset about other people and see that other people are win-win. Their lives are good for them, and their lives are good for the rest of us too.
Mike, but I want to start moving on to policy stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just bring this back to the sort of the practical question about birth rates and depopulation. One thing that came up in this discussion is comparing this 10 billion person population to a 1 billion person population. And although I think we haven't been super clear about this so far, what Dean and I are advocating for is not population growth unending. It's a stable population at some level. And we're not here to say exactly what that level should be, only that it shouldn't be depopulation forever. But on this question of a 10 billion person population versus a 10,000 person population or a 1 billion person population, something that I think may not be obvious is that to achieve any of those states, whether it's a stable population at 1 billion, 2 billion, 4 billion, if that's what you want, then at a practical level, you want the same thing as we do. You just want it at a different point in time, which is for any population to stabilize at any level, even a tiny population, there needs to be about 2 births per 2 adults on average, over the long term across the globe as a whole. So the practical question of what this means for birth rates actually does not hinge on whether you think the right population size is 10 billion people or 8 billion people or 1 billion people.
So let's assume for the moment that you've been able to convince listeners, convince the audience that we are actually now entering depopulation, that the assumption that many people might have that we're still in this rapidly growing population and are going to continue to be in this rapidly growing population is wrong, but really the concern at this point is depopulation. And secondly, that many of the reasons that people might have to assume that that is a good thing, that we should want a less populated world, are wrong. But that is not going to be a world in which we're better able to take care of the environment. It's not going to be a world in which there's more affluence to go around per person, and that perhaps there may even be philosophical reasons to prefer a world with many people leading worthwhile lives rather than fewer people leading those worthwhile lives. All right, well, the obvious question now is, what do we do about that? If all of that is right, is there something we can do without encroaching on the autonomy of people in order to reverse this? Obviously, we don't want a heavy-handed state telling people, you don't get access to contraception. Unless you have children, you're a bad person, and we're going to socially ostracize you, right? The woman's role is in the kitchen, right? We certainly don't want to go back to that, which was the background condition for a lot of the rapid population growth, at least. So are there any public policies that we can embrace that respect the limits on what kind of interventions we think is moral, on what kind of society we want to be living in, but effectively encourages people to have more children than they are currently having in South Korea, in Spain, in Mexico and India for that matter?
Yeah, so I think first, to even be able to answer that question, it's probably right that we need to do a little bit of table setting about why are birth rates low today. And I think the surprising, or an answer that will be surprising to many people, though I don't think it'll be surprising to the people whose profession is studying this, is that we really don't have a great idea. We don't have a covering, we meaning social science, doesn't have a covering theory of why birth rates are low. One of the things that you mentioned is contraception or access to abortion. Contraception and access to abortion are huge. They improve lives of people. They certainly allow people to control the when of having children, the how many, but it's not a good explanation for how we got to low fertility where we are today. And the reason for that is, we had fertility rates declining in the places we could measure it hundreds of years ago. In France, fertility was declining when Lafayette was still fighting alongside Alexander Hamilton in the War for Independence. Today, fertility has been declining rapidly in the last decade in places like Europe. And it's not that what happened is in 2015, women in Sweden got access to contraception and abortion for the first time, right? Fertility rates have been declining after contraception was widely available, and they started their decline before contraception was widely available.
So just to understand your point, Mike, presumably that doesn't mean that contraception doesn't play any role. And in fact, the improvement in the quality of contraception may be one of the things that's going on here. What you're saying is that that's not a sufficient explanation for what's going on, that you can have declines in fertility before widespread access to contraception, and that even long after everybody already has access to contraception, they can continue to decline. So clearly other factors must be in part necessary to explain this. But I don't see how what you just said rules the access to contraception out as one important determining factor in, what kind of population growth you're going to see.
No, it's certainly...
To put it hypothetically, if tomorrow there was no longer any access to condoms, to the pill, to other forms of contraception in the United States, that might not make people want to have a lot more children, but presumably some more children would be born as a result. I'm not advocating that; I think it could be a bad outcome, right? But it would be unlikely to think that if tomorrow you go to the pharmacy you can't buy condoms anymore, that's going to have zero effect on population growth.
No, I don't think it would have zero, and it would be a terrible outcome. But just to see. In any realistic situation, I think you began this discussion with the sort of the specter of possibility that regressive forces in politics would try to take these options away from women and men. And I think that is something to be concerned about and something to fight against. But, I live in Texas, and Texas is a place that for a couple of years has all but banned abortion, right? And you might think that the effect of that would be a huge spike in the number of births. And exactly as you say, the effect hasn't been zero, but it hasn't been very large either. The birth rate in Texas was, I think, about 1.8 before the abortion ban. It's about 1.8 after the abortion ban. The abortion ban has ruined the lives of individuals. It's ruined the health of women. It's scared women in Texas. It's terrible policy, but it hasn't done much to move birth rates. And so the reason I wanted to take a minute and say this is because I think it's actually quite important that we understand that any sort of rollback of reproductive rights or bodily autonomy, for all the harm that it might do, is not going to be the thing that is going to raise birth rates. Not because this doesn't have any impact on birth rates, but because the impacts are small, and they're especially small relative to the harm.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, right? And here I think Iran is a great example, right? That's obviously a society that both is encouraging women to have a good number of children. I don't know the exact details of the availability of contraception and abortion and so on in Iran, but imagine that it's not a particularly progressive place on those metrics, and yet it now has a birth rate well below replacement, because it is a reasonably affluent society. It is a society where, despite some restrictions, women actually have pretty good access to education. And so couples, despite the difficulty, are making the choice to have way fewer kids than their parents did, than the grandparents did. So changing access to contraceptives may have less of an impact than we think. That's not one of the fundamental reasons driving the decline in birth rates. What then is driving the decline in birth rates? What is the best way? I know you said that there's no covering theory, but what is the best way of trying to understand this huge, important, pretty universal phenomenon that's taking place across cultural contexts, across different continents, at relatively different levels of economic development? Is it just something in the air? Is it something in the water? I'm sure some people on Twitter are going to claim it's microplastics or something like that. I don't think that can possibly be the explanation everywhere. What is going on?
So I think that we learn a lot from how big the decline in birth rates is, both how big it is over time. It's something that's been going on for centuries. It's something that we see in a lot of different countries with different systems, so different cultures, different economies. So, in the United States or in Europe, we rightly hear a lot about the conflict between career and family, especially for women, and how it's difficult to combine parenting with education and career aspirations. In fact, the book title, the phrase "career and family" is the title of Claudia Goldin's book, the Economics Nobel Prize winner. But when I think about that as a general explanation for why birth rates are falling, then I start thinking about India. India is a place where the average birth rate is below 2, but it's also a place where female labor force participation remains uncommon, pretty low in international comparison, around 40%. It's a place where marriage remains almost universal. So people talk about, especially in Europe, the decline of birth rates being tied to the retreat from marriage. But in India, marriage remains almost universal and at pretty early ages, and more often than not, especially in Uttar Pradesh where I work, an arranged marriage. But yet we see low birth rates. And instead of seeing people having kids later, like you see in other low birth rate countries, in India, people tend to have their first kids, in their early 20s. And so a lot of these cultural theories don't seem to hold water. We hear people talk about religion or religiosity. Of course, India is a place where religion is very important in people's lives, but also look at Latin America. Latin America is at 1.8 right now, even though 90% of people tell a Pew survey that they're Christian, and a great many of those tell surveyors that they're Catholics. And so it doesn't seem to be, at least not in any universal way, about religiosity. It doesn't seem to be in any universal way about a retreat from marriage. And it's even possible that we can see a low birth rate in a place where female labor force participation remains low. And so it's striking how convergent of an outcome this is, which is part of what tells me that low birth rates are the most likely future, and so depopulation is. Now, a specific thing I haven't mentioned yet that for a listener in the U.S. is, probably at the top of their minds is the cost, the money, the affordability. A thing that, we hear all the time is that people aren't having children just because kids just aren't affordable. The prices of childcare and housing and college are all so much higher than they used to be. Having kids is expensive, but as an explanation for what's different, for why people have fewer kids than they used to, this theory doesn't turn out to work either. And there's a lot to say here, and we go deep on it in the book. But I just want to share a few quick facts that should help at least suggest the idea that the reason people are having fewer kids than they used to isn't really about money or affordability. I mean, the first, sort of the clearest, is that people in poor countries and poorer states within the U.S. tend to have more babies, not fewer babies. The poorest region on Earth is sub-Saharan Africa, and it's also the region with the highest birth rates. Lots of data that you could look in, birth rates tend to be higher amongst poorer people. That's flattened recently in the U.S., but it's not as though richer people are having large families and poorer people are having fewer or no children. So, Only so you have to take evidence like that at a grain of salt, but it's a good place to start setting the table about what might be possible. Okay, so maybe you think affordability is not about incomes or the size of your budget, but it's about prices and how much things cost. And childcare is expensive, college is expensive, health care for children is expensive, and there are other countries in the world that have made a successful effort compared to the United States to make children more affordable. They have free or heavily subsidized daycare. They have free or heavily subsidized college. Healthcare is free. So places like Canada, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, they don't have higher birth rates than the United States. It's 1.6 in the US, 1.5 in Denmark, 1.3 in Canada. And so that's hard to square with a theory that affordability in the sense of what you have to buy for children is fundamentally the explanation. And just to be a bit silly, because we're economists, there's a natural experiment that we can look at that tells us what happens when individual people get richer. We can ask what happens when women win the lottery. And so there are economics papers where people have looked at young women who win the lottery and compare them with young women who played the lottery. So, they're in the pool of they could have won. They opted into the lottery, but either they didn't win or they won a much smaller prize. And so they're a control group. And what's almost literally amounts to a randomized experiment. Now, okay, don't overemphasize this, but then what happens? You can look at the tax records and see how their economic situations and their families evolved. And younger women who win the lottery don't choose larger families than women who played the lottery and lost or won by smaller amounts. And so that's not to say that money doesn't matter, but I think it does tell us very clearly that whatever's happening here is more complicated than just dollars.
That is a really interesting quasi-natural experiment about the lottery, and it does suggest that it's not just an affordability question, right? I mean, obviously, the poverty can't be the explanation for the reason you say, which is that poor people tend to have more children. Then there's a kind of secondary theory, which I do think has a lot of intuitive plausibility, which is, well, if you're a certain kind of upper middle class person in a big urban center in the United States, you have expectations about what responsible child rearing would involve, which may or may not be fair expectations, but I can't just send my kid to the local public school. They have to go to a fancy private school, and they have to go to this kind of summer camp, and we have to make sure they end up going to a good college, and that therefore how expensive it is to engage in that kind of high intensity parenting is what stops people. And I think the lottery study is a relatively good indication. But that doesn't seem to be it either, because if you have a big winning in the lottery, then presumably you can pay for that private school tuition. But doesn't seem to be what stops people. What about the broader cultural expectation, though? It does seem to be the case across the globe, so far as I can tell, or at least in many places that now have low birth rates, that the number of hours that parents spend with their kids has significantly increased over the course of the last decades. That what is expected of a decent parent is much higher than it was in the past. And therefore, having children is more costly, not necessarily in financial terms, not necessarily in terms of can I afford the daycare, can I afford the school, but also in terms of opportunity cost, also in terms of, is it possible to integrate a kid into a thriving life? And part of the problem here may also be a collective problem. But if you have a society in which everybody has 2, 3, 4 kids, a dinner party of adults on the weekend might be, come over with your kids, we're going to put them in some room to play together, we're going to have a good time, right? Whereas today, dinner party means you have to hire a babysitter and entrust your kids to a stranger and pay a lot of money for that, and then you're going to come over for 2.5 hours and then you go home to relieve the babysitter, and that sounds a lot less fun. So the opportunity cost also goes up, not just because of high expectations of what parenting involves, but because you don't have the social context in which you're in a community where everybody has kids, and therefore it's easier to integrate that into your life. Is that a plausible explanation, or do you think, look, that sounds plausible, but the data just doesn't seem to back that up?
It certainly sounds plausible. I think where we are in trying to understand low fertility and what sort of responses might move the needle on it, we're just pretty. It might sound crazy to say this in 2025, but we're pretty much in early days. I'm a member of one of those families that gets together with 2 other families every Sunday night and has the dinner party, and the kids all play together. I understand that there's that people aren't making these decisions individually. They're doing this in a social context. They're thinking about the life story that they want to build for themselves. They're thinking about their relationships to their siblings. They're thinking about their relationships to their friends, and thinking about what they can fit in to a good life. So there's lots of hypotheses like this that I think the agenda for social science researchers should be to try to understand these things better. Another thing that I would like to understand better, and I would like there to be more studies about, is what's the role of optimism and pessimism here, about how you feel about the future. Do you think your children are going to get to live a good life? I think objectively there's a lot of reason to think that children are going to get to live a good life born in 2025 relative to being born at any other time in human history. If there's ever been a good chance to live a good life, born to a globally random life, I think it's now. But I know a lot of young people don't feel that way. And so I'd like to see work on that. But I think we're really pretty far from understanding what are the root causes here. Are these cultural factors downstream of economics, or is the economics downstream of cultural factors? And in part, one of the things that we're asking for in our book and in our work and our advocacy is for more attention to this issue, more serious attention, not someone sort of firing off armchair hypotheses about what might be causing this, but real serious work by social scientists, because I think we still have a long way to go.
One solution that people might have in mind as we're listening to this conversation is immigration, right? If we, for the foreseeable future, have high birth rates in sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps not by 2100 and so on, but at the moment there's still many countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have birth rates well above replacement, rapidly growing countries, and then you have all of these other countries in North America, in Europe, in East Asia, that are rapidly declining. Well, can't we just rebalance the global population by moving people from one place to another, and wouldn't that help to effectively solve things? Now, there might be, one kind of answer here, which is that some places may be culturally reluctant to that. North America historically is a society of immigrants, less the case for Europe, even less the case for East Asian societies, so they may not want to choose that route. The second point that I might make as a political scientist is, even if you have no normative objection to this, if you don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with this, you might say, is that going to be conducive to stable democracies? Isn't one of the reasons why we've seen the rise of right-wing populism and destabilizing political institutions in many societies, particularly in Europe over the last decades, that they have much higher rates of immigration in the past, and that seems to make some people quite angry. So even if you yourself are not angry about that, you might think, I don't want to live in a society where a lot of people are really angry and vote for those kind of politicians. But I think there's also a third thing to mention here, which goes back to math, which is that sort of the rate of immigration you would need is, I believe, much higher than people intuitively think. Tell us a little bit about, if Italy, or if Japan, or if the United States wanted to get to replacement level fertility simply through immigration, how many immigrants would they have to have next year, and how many immigrants would they have to have each year in order to accomplish that goal?
Great. So this is a point where it's really important to separate out the questions that we often hear about depopulation, which are about the population size in one country or another, maybe from a nationalist perspective or maybe just from an economic feasibility perspective, on the one hand, versus the question that we're talking about and that we address in our book, which is about global depopulation. So the UN and other demographers make projections of how population would be changing if there were no more immigration, and it were only based on birth rates and death rates. And the answer is that, for a country like the United States, depopulation would be coming very soon. That the size of the population would, if not already be shrinking, at least happening sooner than you might think, because the rate of natural increase in the United States, or the gap between births and deaths, is already very low. The birth rate in the U.S. is 1.6. Now, for the world as a whole, there is no immigration on or off the planet. And so we only have the difference between births and death rates. And so insofar as our question is about global depopulation and what's going to happen for the world as a whole, then immigration is something of a sideshow.
Right, it's just by definition, you're not going to solve the problem of global depopulation through immigration. But what about what a lot of people are going to care about, which is, well, what about the United States? Should we somehow find a way to encourage people to have more kids, to empower them to have more kids, if that's the locution you prefer? Or do we just solve that problem through immigration? Why is it that mathematically that is hard?
So I think that, if you ask my personal political preferences. I'm a person who goes to India all the time. I'm a person who thinks that that there's a lot that we gain from a world in which people move around a lot. But I think part of what even asking this question gets at is that we're not yet at the point of searching for solutions, I would say. We're still at the point of having a conversation with people about what sort of future should we be wanting. And so if we were to go out in public and say that what we need is to radically overhaul policy on immigration, because of some, what's going to happen to the size of the population decades from now, I don't think there's going to be a lot of appetite for that. And I don't think that'd be the place to start. But, I'm not a political candidate. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I want to get back to something about the sort of the social science of this, which is that the theory here is that some places are going to have faster population growth than others, that there may be enclaves or countries. And so in the long run, if any one small group is going to sort of prop up the size of the population for the rest of us, then they're going to have to, that group would have to continue having positive population growth. And so hidden behind all of this is it even feasible that a small group could have the sort of enduring long-term population growth that, whether it's through immigration or some other means, could cause the whole to have positive population growth, even if many places don't? So that's a question that we get a lot in different forms. One form of it is the immigration question. Another form of it, which might not seem like the same question, but sort of formally is like, what about the Amish, right? So Amish have high birth rates, people say to us, and so won't there eventually be enough Amish people to populate the whole world? And so that's not a question of immigration if they already live in Pennsylvania, but it's sort of a similar question about a subgroup. And so we ended up digging into this and looking at the data and looking at the theory. It turns out that, of course, it is theoretically possible for a small subset of the population to cause positive long-term population growth, but it's not very practically likely because two things have to be the case. Like, one is that they would have to sort of retain some sort of cohesion as a group, even as the dynamics of the world as a whole change. And so, the Amish would have to continue having, the cohesion of higher birth rates, even as they become a larger and larger fraction of the world, or immigrants that move to another society would have to sort of keep their origin birth rates with them when they move, which is, at minimum an open question whether that's something that would happen, or whether they would assimilate and adopt more of the practices and including birth rates of the places that they move to. The other thing is that the birth rate of the high birth rate group would have to stay not just high, but above replacement. And so what I think about a lot when I think about this is the difference between birth rates amongst Hindus and Muslims in India. And so within India, there's long been this political question or this political issue where like Hindu politicians would criticize Muslims or would sort of wag a finger at Muslims and say they have higher birth rates. And it's true that on average, if you look at data from India, the birth rate amongst Muslims is greater than the birth rate amongst Hindus. But it's also true that you see both of these going down over time in parallel. And so it's not like the Muslim population of India is going to, in the long term have above replacement birth rates, and the Hindu population is going to have below replacement replacement birth rates. It's that both of these groups, even if there's a difference between them, are probably going to be below replacement. So if that's what ends up happening, then no small group is going to prop up the whole with above replacement birth rates. And so in the long run, I think that this just isn't really the story for what's going to happen.
Quick procedural question. Do you guys have 10 more minutes? Okay, great. I don't want to cut it off. I think we're getting towards the end, but let me think how to. Great. Yeah. Let me. So that's very interesting. My understanding from reading in some of this literature is that part of the phenomenon here is that when you have immigrants coming to a society, they start to have more similar birth rates to people in that society. But what that also means is that I think people have this kind of intuitive concept of, well, if the United States just let in 1 or 2 million people of net immigrants for a couple of years, then they would kind of add to the population momentum in such a way that it lastingly resolves this demographic problem. But actually, since those immigrants would then quite quickly come to have the same birth rates as the population in the country, you effectively would have to have a very large percentage of immigrants each year forever in order to really change the long-term population trajectory. And then
eventually the place they're coming from would probably also be depopulating. And so it would be a literal impossibility that it could keep happening forever.
Right, but even if you assume somehow that place keeps supplying you with people, you would just end up with much larger shares of immigration much more quickly than people who make this argument, I think, implicitly have a grasp on, which is interesting. I would love to hear a little bit more about this alternative scenario, right? When you look at a country like Israel, you have seen over the course of decades that the share between the secular Jewish population and the Orthodox Jewish population, to a slightly lesser extent the Arab population, has shifted because some of these groups had a lot more kids than others. Is it imaginable that a group like the Amish is going to prove so capable of resisting outside influences, is going to prove so capable of sustaining the very high birth rates that they do now, that they would come to have a much higher share of the population in the United States than today? And perhaps that doesn't mean that they single-handedly mean the United States now is growing rapidly for the next 100 years or 200 years. But perhaps it does mean that the Amish would go from being, 0.2% of the population in the United States today to 20 or 30% of the population today. And if at the same time you have some different evangelical Christian group and perhaps an Orthodox Jewish group and perhaps some kind of Salafist Muslim group that also somehow has figured out, how to create these conditions where you do get most families to have 5 or 6 kids, and most of those kids to also have 5 or 6 kids, even if 1 or 2 go and enter a secular society. That is a recipe for a society that would look vastly different from today in 50 or 100 years. Be much more religious, perhaps much more tribal. Is that one of the futures we should expect and perhaps fear, or do you just think that's unlikely to happen?
I think that's unlikely, and let me say why. That's not to say that it's impossible, but today people might look at Israel or the Amish as a high fertility group, but history contains lots of examples of high fertility groups, and the historical record of those cultures, those religions, those traditions hanging together unchanged generation through generation, it's not supported in history. So for one, we talked about Latin America having below replacement fertility. There's been, a shift in Latin America of religious observance. But actually, I think I have an example from my own family that I think is pretty instructive. So my grandparents on my mother's side immigrated to the U.S. from Canada. They were French speakers. They came from Quebec. My grandmother had 11 brothers and sisters. There were 12 kids in her family. She immigrated to the United States. They set up their home in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, where there was a huge immigrant enclave of French Canadians. My mother went to school at a French Catholic school, attached to a church in town. She was taught by nuns in French. She spoke nothing but French for the first, school years of her life. But she grew up to basically forget all of her French, to use contraception against the teachings of the Catholic Church, which was a big part of her life, and to have two kids. And my grandmother, by the way, also had two kids. So over the course, obviously, that's just one anecdote, but I think it illustrates something that at some level we all kind of understand when we're thinking about our own lives, but we don't always equally apply when thinking about other people's lives, which is that your kids might not choose to inherit your cultural traditions. Your grandkids might not choose to inherit your cultural traditions. And it might be all the harder to maintain those cultural ties, those traditions, those religious observances, as that group becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. I think it's not incidental to the story that the moment in which those traditions from a big family to a small family broke towards smaller families was exactly the moment when my grandmother's family felt like they needed to move on from Canada to spread out into the world. And so as these populations get bigger and bigger, I think I would not bet on those cultural traditions adhering and staying stable generation after generation after generation. It's just not the thing that we've seen.
But isn't there a way of reading that same evidence a little bit the other way around, Mike, which is to say that on the one side, if you are the majority population, it's very hard to sustain those very tight-knit social norms for a very long time, and that's why you get, your great-grandmother's family was not atypical, right? In her society, there was many families that had that many children, and that was the same or similar in that same time for Catholics in Ireland, and for that matter for Hindus in India, and for Muslims in the Middle East, and for Orthodox Jews in certain parts of, I suppose back then, Central Europe, right? And in each of those societies, there was then a very big cultural shift within most of those societies where they started having many fewer children as modernity took hold, as women had more access to education. So all of those things we've been talking about happened, right? But when we do see small groups sustain these really high fertility rates for a long time, that often is precisely because they are minority groups, because they are saying we're shielding ourselves off from the majority of society. And doesn't that imply that somebody like the Amish might be able to sustain that for the next 100 years as they go from being 0.2% of the population to 20-30% of the population? Perhaps at that point it might start to break down, but if that's the case for the Amish, and it's the case for Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn, and it's the case for certain Salafi Muslims in Minnesota, that means that by 2100, by 2150, we're going to have a US population, the majority of which comes from these very deeply religious sects, and then perhaps that's going to start to change. But that would still radically transform what the country looks like as a result of these kind of demographic phenomena.
My read of the situation is that it would change long before the Amish became 20 or 30% of the U.S. population. I mean, even just looking back not that long. So Amish today are, I think, less than 400,000 people, right? And so even if we just look back in history, don't worry about the future in which the Pennsylvania Dutch run out of Pennsylvania in which to raise barns. Even looking back the last few decades, the birth rate among the Amish, and this is hard to estimate, but sociologist, demographer Lyman Stone has some estimates for birth rates among the Amish, and those have been falling. So even though the Amish today are less than 500,000 people in the United States, birth rates among the Amish have already fallen from something like 8 children per woman to something closer to 5 children per woman. So, part of the reason I don't expect this to happen is that even the societies that we call the high fertility enclaves today, these are enclaves in which fertility is falling and is lower than in the past. So I think that's another reason, besides the sort of weak ties across generations that bind children to their parents' traditions, especially as those children spread out in space. Just the fact that these high fertility enclaves are becoming lower fertility over time is a reason to sort of doubt that sort of future.
All right, great. So let's take a step back and say you've convinced us that there's in fact a crisis of depopulation rather than a crisis of population growth or overpopulation. That this is actually bad, that this is going to have really negative consequences for the lives of people in affluent countries and for the lives of people in poorer countries around the world. That we want to do something about that. One interesting reason why we might want to do something about that in the United States is that it doesn't necessarily require persuading people of something they don't want. When you look at opinion polls, most people in the United States, including most women in the United States, consistently express a preference for having more children than they end up having. So you're not necessarily having to persuade women you don't want to have kids. We're somehow persuading you to have kids. Perhaps all that will be required is to empower women to have a number of kids that, according to opinion polls, they themselves say they want to have. But at the same time, you've showed us that it's hard to do that. That if you win the lottery, you don't necessarily have more kids, which means it doesn't just seem to be about economic growth. That countries from Scandinavia to Canada to France that have these very generous policies about preschool, and you don't have to pay for university, and you get health insurance, nevertheless are at these low birth rates. So what is the upshot of all of that? What can we do if we really are concerned about this problem? What is the takeaway, the so what, that listeners should take from this conversation?
We are at the very beginning of facing up to this challenge. Societies overall have to come to terms with the magnitude of what we're facing, of how big of a change this is going to be. And so even if we don't have all the answers yet, and we don't, that means it's way too early to give up hope on changing course. So depopulation is the path we're on, but it's not inevitable. We wouldn't have written this book calling to avoid depopulation and stabilize instead if we thought that it weren't possible to change course. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to tell you our 10-point policy solution with accompanying legislation, because jumping to a policy solution right now is probably the wrong move. This isn't something that's going to turn around in one presidential term or because of one set of legislated considerations for parents, like parental leave or tax credits or anything. I feel pretty confident that if Kamala Harris had narrowly defeated Donald Trump instead of Donald Trump narrowly defeating Kamala Harris, the birth rate at the end of this presidential term in the U.S. would be pretty similar. Instead, what we need right now, the first step is many more people thinking about this, talking about this, and coming to share a belief that we should want something to change. That's a necessary precursor. So if you're asking what to do, if you're already convinced and need to know what to do next, then invite more people into this conversation. Talk with your friends and family and classmates and colleagues, and see if you can convince them that people are fundamentally good for one another. And if not, ask why not and listen and talk about that. That's got to be step one. And while all that's going on, in the meantime, those of us who do social science for our jobs should be building out the social science to understand better what might work, so that once the social and political support materializes, we'll know what to do. But there are a lot of minds to change first, and there's a lot to learn first. Sometimes we think about this, Mike and I, we think about this with an analogy to climate change and climate policy. In the 1950s, a few scientists were already starting to raise the alarm about climate change, and especially in the 1960s, we had Johnson talking to Congress, we had an important White House report. People knew a lot back then of the highest level fact that if societies kept burning fossil fuels and they would put carbon into the atmosphere, and that would cause greenhouse gas pollution that would eventually warm the population. So that basic fact, in fact, sort of the chemistry of it from Arrhenius has been known longer than that, right? And so at the highest level, we've known for about 6 decades or longer, we've been talking about it for 6 decades or longer, the biggest picture outlines of the population. But, nobody had all of the answers back then. We didn't have the social movement, we didn't have the political movement, we didn't have the technological details. And if somebody had stood up and said that in some immediate sense, we need to pass a piece of legislation right now in the 1960s to ban the internal combustion engine, it would have been, not only unproductive, it would have been harmful, because it would have been been laughable. It would have been ridiculous. What needed to happen was a decades-long project of learning, of research, of building a social movement, of building a political movement, so that right now, 6 decades later, we would have journals like Nature Climate Change and university departments and no more, and have a more robust political movement. Of course, it could have been better if all of these things happened better in future, but better and faster and more robustly. But we're in a much better position right now to do something about climate change than we would have been 6 decades ago, even though 6 decades ago they knew a basic and important fact. And so we feel like we're in a similar situation here about depopulation. The UN projects the peak to be 6 decades from now in the 2080s. And right now we know a big picture fact that if birth rates go below 2 and stay there, then we're going to get global depopulation, and that's pretty likely. So like the climate pioneers in the 1960s, all of us alive and working today are decades away from having all of the answers that we need. But if we can make progress even at the slow pace, even at the seemingly frustrating pace that the climate movement has made progress, well, I would call that a pretty big win for where we might be 6 decades from now. And that's a reason to have hope about this.
Michael Geruso and Dean Spears, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.